Hello, my name is Sita Sumagani. In this video, I would like to give a brief introduction to Nexacro and show how you can build a mobile web application using Nexacro Studio. Nexacro is a rapid mobile application development platform that enables building hybrid mobile applications using drag and drop while working with a single source. Developers can use Nexacro's rich UI toolkit to build web-based responsive user interfaces and bind the UI to live data using drag and drop. Nexacro's multi-layout manager allows developers to add custom layouts for different form factors and build beautiful-looking user interfaces regardless of the number of devices to support. The applications can then be packaged to run on Android, iOS or Windows phones or tablets or any browser on personal computers without writing any platform-specific code. The Nexacro platform comes with the MVC framework that provides developers with a clear separation of the declarative UI, the logic written in JavaScript, and the data sets that manage the data in the application. Nexacro platform's powerful grid component offers developers Excel-like functionality within their web applications that allows easy display and manipulation of large datasets. Nexacro's open platform allows developers to plug in other libraries, SDKs, and APIs for building a rich functionality. So let's dive right in to get a first-hand look at a developer's perspective of the Nexacro Studio. Here I have in front of me is the Nexacro Studio with a blank project. The visual toolkit that you see here, the menu bars, the views and perspectives are a rich set of features that developers can get started with to get building with a low learning curve while eliminating the drudgery of writing boilerplate code. The blank canvas that we see here is of a dimensions 1024 by 768, and this forms the home page of the web application that we are going to build. Opening the toolbox here, I can find a number of user interface components that can be drawn onto the blank canvas. These UI elements are responsive to begin with. I can build a simple web application by drawing a couple of UI components here. And when I run this application, you can see that this is responsive to begin with. I can resize the browser and see that the elements do scale according to the width of the browser. Let's see how we can style the web page here. So I can select the button and change its text in the properties view to something that I would like, and change its background color and its font. And give it a drop shadow. All by changing the attributes in the properties view without editing any CSS. The properties view gives you all the attributes that can be set on an element. That includes the layout, appearance, the position, the styling, and the event attributes, which can be set to event handlers. Let's see how we can bind some data to this web page. To bind data, we would use a component called a dataset. A dataset encapsulates the data binding behavior in a Nexacro application. The dataset binds data from the server to the UI and binds the changes in the data made by the UI back to the server. To add a dataset to the application, I would drag and drop a dataset component onto the screen, and that would create a new dataset. To put this dataset to use, I would create a new schema for the dataset. For the sake of example, I will create a simple schema with just a single column called name. Within the dataset, we have the option of specifying not just the schema but also the data, so that the data is static on the client. So for this example, I would like to use as my sample data neighborhoods in New York City for the purpose of finding a good restaurant to eat. So I would add a new row by clicking on this button and going on to edit the columns. I can type in the data that I would like to add right here. So I would go Astoria, Long Island City, and last but not the least, Hell's Kitchen. So now the dataset is ready to be bound. But first, I would like to change the name of the dataset by changing its ID right here to something representative of the data. So I'm going to call it neighborhoods. So to bind this dataset to the UI, I would need a component that can show, say, a vector of values. For that, I'm going to use a list box. I'm going to drag and drop it on the screen. To show an empty list box. To bind this, all I have to do is drag and drop the dataset onto the list box. I would have to answer a simple question about which column is going to be used as the code and as the data. The code column is what gets sent to the server in case of changes, and the data column is what gets displayed. And as we can see, the data appears right away in the list box. And any changes made to the dataset here are going to reflect on the UI instantly. So let's proceed to adding some behavior to this page. We can write code in the script tab of this page. So the script tab is where we can write the JavaScript code for handling the events or the business logic. To create a new event though, we can simply double click, say, on a component like a button, and have a default event handler created and attached to the button. Here the on-click event handler is created and added to the button and is opened up for us to start writing code. As an example, I will try to set a text to the text field when the button is created. So this can be done by writing some JavaScript code, and Nexacro provides the namespaces and utility functions for ease of writing the event handling logic. So all the components that appear on the screen are added to this object. So if I do this dot, I can get access to the components that are on the screen. To get access to the edit box, you can type edit and the ID of the edit box comes up. Dot set value hello world, and we can see this in action by clicking on the launch project button and clicking on the button to see the code execute. So let's try to do something more interesting here. Let's try to say set the text field to the item in the list box that was selected, so the neighborhood that was selected by the user from the list box. To do that, we would first need to fetch the index of the item that was selected in the list box. So we can do that by first try to finding a reference to the list box, which is going to be this dot list box 00 dot get selected items. This is going to return the indexes of the item selected. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to assume that it's only going to be 1, and this index has to be used to look up the item in the data set. For that, I would use this dot neighborhoods is the name of the data set, dot get column is the call to get the data at a certain row and a certain index. So the arguments are the row index and the column index, and this should set the name of the item that was selected in the list box to the text field. To quickly see this in action, we can select Long Island City, address, Williamsburg, or Hell's Kitchen. So this was an example of Nexacro's MVC architecture in action. Developers can drag and drop their components onto the screen that represents a clear separation of concerns. The toolbox shows the UI components, and the invisible objects shows the data sets, and the script tab shows the controller logic that can be written to handle events and the business logic. The source tab shows the declarative UI that renders the final UI. Let us now move on to a distinguishing feature of Nexacro platform, which is the multi-layout manager. The multi-layout manager addresses the problem of building responsive user interfaces for different form factors. The multi-layout manager achieves this by using drag and drop and without having to write a single line of code. If we were to run this application in a browser of a small width, then we can see certain problems. So now at this width, we can see that the button is too narrow, and so is the text field and the list box. We can use multi-layout manager to quickly fix this problem. To do that, let's move on to the design view and right click on the form and click on layout list. That's going to show a pop-up where we can add a new layout. So I'm going to call my new layout mobile and give it the least width at which this layout should be applied, which I'm going to choose as 320 pixels. So once I create this, there is a new layout created that represents how the UI is going to look like in a browser of these dimensions or in a device of these dimensions. So I'm going to adjust this layout so that it makes sense and makes the best use of the space that is available. So I'm going to make these elements use the most of their horizontal space and lay them vertically so that they have the most space available to them. If we run this project now, we can see that the elements are aligned vertically and making the best use of the space and are not scrunched up, and even in a narrow width such as 320 pixels, the application looks good. And we can also notice that once we expand the browser to a width beyond 1024 pixels, the default layout takes over, and once it goes below 1024, the new mobile layout is applied. So let's make this application a little bit more interesting. We could use this application to say search for restaurants in the area that the user selects. To do that, we would need a service that provides us the listing of the restaurants. For that purpose, we could use Foursquare. Foursquare lets users search for restaurants by different search parameters. The parameters that we would like to use here are the cuisine and the neighborhood that we would like to search in. To do that, we would have to access the open API that Foursquare provides, and Nexacro will let you call any API by first defining a service. So I'm going to define a service by adding one right here and call it Foursquare, making it type of JSP, and point it to the servlet that I wrote that interacts with Foursquare's API. It's hosted at trainingserver.nexaweb.com and it's called 16. Now that this service is added, it shows up here under the Project Explorer. Now we can use this service in a data set so that the data set fetches data from the service and binds it to a UI. So we would need to create another data set that shows the list of restaurants that are the search results. So first, I would like to rename this data set to restaurants and then give it a schema, which would be the name of the restaurant, address, and also maybe I would like to see how many check-ins that a restaurant has so that I have a criteria to compare. And that's all. We're not going to add any data since that's going to be fetched from Foursquare. So to show this data on the screen, we would use the grid component. The grid component is a very powerful Nexaweb component that lets you show two-dimensional data while providing a simple expressive language for sorting and grouping the rows within the data. Now to bind the restaurants data set to this grid, I will drag and drop it on the table. We can see that the headers are created automatically. To change the way that this grid looks, we can double click on it and use the grid contents editor to change the widths of these headers and columns. So now, to get data from Foursquare and load it into this table, let us take advantage of this button. So let's repurpose this event on the button to do something more useful. So we would need the cuisine and the neighborhood selected by the user to make a call to Foursquare to fetch the restaurants. So first I would like to get the cuisine that the user might enter into the text field by this dot edit dot value, and the neighborhood by this dot dataset, which is neighborhoods dot get column, and give it the index of the selected row in the list box, which would be this dot list box dot get selected items, and the first column. To make a call to Foursquare's API, we would use Nexacro's transaction API. So we could do that by doing this dot transaction and passing it some required and some optional parameters. So the first parameter is a unique identifier, and the second is the URL of the service, which would be Foursquare : search / name of the neighborhood and followed by another slash cuisine. The next parameter is optional, and in the next parameter we would specify the data set that is going to be bound by this call. That we would do by saying restaurants equals ds_out, so that on the server side the data set, which is called ds_out, is going to be bound to the data set on the client, which is called restaurants. So we can quickly run this and take a look. Click on the launch project button. So in the first field, I'm going to type in the cuisine that I would like to eat, which is sushi, and pick the neighborhood Astoria, and on clicking of the button I should see the list of restaurants returned by Foursquare's API that serve sushi and are close to the neighborhood that I picked. So the first one is near Astoria. If I'd like to search in Hell's Kitchen, then we can see that these are Manhattan. So the list of restaurants here is in the same order that is sent by Foursquare, and if we would like to sort these by, say, the number of check-ins, then we can do that easily by using the data set. So we can go pick the data set and set the keystring property. For sort, I would use s : and sort in a descending order minus, and followed by the name of the column to sort by. And to see this in action, let's search for sushi again in Hell's Kitchen. And now we can see that the table is sorted in descending order of check-ins. So that's how easy it is to build a mobile web application that is responsive to the browser width and the form factor, and that can contain individual tailor-made layouts for specific form factors, and that uses MVC framework for keeping the complexity of the application very low, and that can bind to different services simply by